Football players cover total distances ranging between 10 to 13 kilometres, and depending on playing position, around 2.5 kilometres are covered at high speeds, while 0.3 to 0.6 kilometres are covered by sprinting, achieved through completing between 40 to 60 sprint efforts during a game. Players can clock top speeds between 32.5 to 34.5 kilometres per hour. High-intensity efforts are typically followed by 60 to 70 seconds recovery before the next one, with a work-to-rest ratio being around 1 to 12, but can be as short as 1 to 2 during intense periods of a match, especially for central midfielders, where the recovery between consecutive high-intensity actions is often less than 20 seconds. It's estimated that during a match, that aerobic energy systems account for 70 to 90% of total energy consumption, while anaerobic energy systems account for the remainder. This is reflected by average heart rates being around 85% of maximum during a match, with heart rates peaking at 98% of max. And blood lactate has been reported to exceed 12 millimoles, indicating that players should not only possess a high VO2 max, but also have the ability to utilise a high percentage of it. Depending on playing position, top-level players can have a relative VO2 max between 60 to 75, with 16 to 18 km an hour being the estimated velocity at VO2 max. Therefore, players should possess a high capacity for both aerobic and anaerobic energy production to cope with the distances covered and to aid recovery between intense actions, as well as the ability to perform repetitive high-intensity work. High-intensity interval training is recognised as an effective piece of the training puzzle to develop these qualities. However, during the season, one of the key challenges is how to optimise the dosage of HIIT to help ensure players aren't training too much and risking injury, while at the same time enhancing performance. Intensified training has been highlighted as a solution to overcome these challenges. Intensified training refers to a period of typically a few weeks where the intensity is increased by prescribing various forms of HIIT, while the overall training volume is retained or ideally lowered. In the review article titled Performance Adaptations to Intensified Training in Top-Level Football by Morten and Jens, outline the characteristics of aerobic and anaerobic training during intensified periods of training. They reviewed the effect that intensified training has on yo-yo intermittent recovery test performance, and in doing so, provide recommendations for the different types of HIIT training when implementing periods of intensified training with elite players. This presentation, brought to you by Talking Sports Science, will be a summary of their recommendations. Firstly, aerobic training aims to develop the aerobic capacity, and based on heart rate is divided into low, moderate and high intensity aerobic training. When the aim is to enhance the ability to cover long distances at high intensity and recover from intense actions, aerobic high intensity training is considered the lowest intensity zone to use when implementing periods of intensified training. Aerobic HIIT comprise either long or short intervals working above 90% of maximum heart rate. Long intervals are typically between 1 to 4 minutes using a work-to-rest ratio between 3 to 1 and 1 to 1, completing between 2 to 8 repetitions. For example, 4 times 4 minutes at above 90% of maximum heart rate using a work-to-rest ratio of 2 to 1. Whereas short intervals can range between 10 to 60 seconds using a work-to-rest ratio of between 2 to 1 and 1 to 1, completing between 8 to 30 repetitions. For example, 12 times 30 seconds at above 90% of maximum heart rate, using a work-to-rest ratio of 2 to 1. Depending on the format and rules, aerobic high-intensity training can be implemented in small-sided games while still working above 90% of maximum heart rate. However, due to the large degree of variability in player actions and speed during small-sided games, if the focus is only to develop the capacity of the aerobic energy systems as much as possible, then more controlled generic drills are recommended. Moving on to anaerobic training, which is divided into speed training and speed endurance training, with speed endurance training being a key component when implementing periods of intensified training, which depending on the intensity, duration and recovery can be further divided into production and maintenance. Production training aims to enhance the ability to perform repeated high-intensity exercise, whereas maintenance training aims to enhance the ability to tolerate fatigue during high-intensity exercise. When implementing production training, the work duration is typically between 15 to 40 seconds, at between 70 to 100% of maximal speed, with the work-to-rest ratio ranging between 1 to 5 to 1 to 8, while completing between 4 to 12 repetitions, for example, completing 6 times 30 seconds at near maximal speed while resting 3 minutes between efforts. While in maintenance training, the work duration is normally between 15 to 90 seconds, at intensities ranging between 50 to 80% of maximal speed, using a 1:1 to 1:3 work-to-rest ratio, with the work bout completed 6 to 12 times, for example, 6 times 60 seconds at 70% of maximal speed, while recovering for 2 minutes between efforts. Speed endurance maintenance training can also be conducted with shorter work intervals of between 5 to 15 seconds, with the intensity ranging between 60 to 100% of maximal speed, using a 1:2 to 1:5 work-to-rest ratio, with the work bout completed 10 to 25 times. For example, 3 sets of 6 times 5 seconds at near to maximal speed, while recovering for 15 seconds between efforts. The long recovery with speed endurance production and maintenance training ensures that players retain high speeds through each bout, and the longer recovery between bouts using production compared to speed endurance maintenance training allows for a higher intensity and utilization of anaerobic energy systems. As a caution, these sessions can result in substantial neuromuscular fatigue and muscle damage, especially in unaccustomed players. Like aerobic high-intensity training, speed endurance training can be implemented in technical drills and small-sided games, such as 1v1 or 2v2. Because the intensity is based on speed, the appropriate intensity cannot be assessed using heart rates. Therefore, coaches can qualitatively assess players' effort and encourage them to work maximally, or intensity may be objectively assessed by using accelerometers and GPS trackers, for example. During intensified training periods, aiming to enhance players' ability to tolerate the distances covered and aid recovery between intense actions, the amount of aerobic high-intensity training can be increased. But when the aim is to enhance the ability to perform repeated intense exercise, the amount of speed endurance training is typically increased, while the respective amount of aerobic low and moderate intensity training is decreased, so the overall weekly training load completed is balanced. Following a period of intensified training completed in the late preparation phase or the competitive season, when it comes to looking at the effect of speed endurance production and maintenance training on yo-yo intermittent recovery test performance, from the literature reviewed, no clear differences in performance was evident among elite football players. However, it was noted that greater heart rate responses after speed endurance maintenance compared to speed endurance production training suggests a higher cardiovascular load follows speed endurance maintenance. Therefore, speed endurance maintenance training may be superior in terms of maintaining or increasing the aerobic capacity, whereas speed endurance production training possibly induces greater anaerobic stimuli and external load. Nevertheless, both forms of speed endurance training are effective at enhancing the ability to perform high-intensity exercise. Moving on to the recommendations, before conducting periods of intensified training, the seasonal phase, match schedule, and player load all need to be considered, and because professional players can play over 50 matches during the season, this can make the planning of intensified training periods a challenge. Because aerobic fitness is essential for recovery processes, aerobic HIIT is recommended as a fundamental part of training both in and out of the season, but with different dosing strategies. Specifically, during the off-season, alongside resistance training, small doses of aerobic HIIT performed once a week is recommended to maintain or improve aerobic fitness. This is to help prevent detraining and to reduce the risk of injury during the subsequent pre-season phase when training load increases. Regarding pre-season, during the early preparation phase, it's recommended to progressively increase the dose of aerobic HIIT up until the late preparation phase, typically a few weeks before the season starts. During the late preparation phase, the amount of speed endurance training and speed training can be increased, while lowering the amount of low to moderate intensity aerobic training. The advantage of speed endurance training is that it is time efficient, implements easily in drills using the ball, and only a small dose is needed to be beneficial, which is why during the late preparation phase, only 1 to 2 sessions of speed endurance training performed over 1 to 2 weeks is recommended. Throughout the competitive season, the combination of aerobic high-intensity training and speed endurance training is relevant for substitute and rotation players. However, a busy match schedule rarely allows for both types of HIIT to be performed simultaneously in players playing over 60 minutes per match. If constraints allow it, training prescription can be based on the player's individual needs and incorporated in technical or tactical drills with ball to optimize specificity and transfer of training. If the aim is to improve aerobic fitness and the ability to recover, then aerobic high-intensity training should be prioritised. However, speed endurance maintenance training may also be implemented to help players to tolerate fatigue and sustain the many high-speed runs, while still imposing a high cardiovascular load in the training. Regarding positional needs, although all players need a base level of aerobic fitness, aerobic high-intensity training is particularly relevant for central midfielders, who often need to cover longer distances and have shorter recovery periods than other playing positions. Wingers and fullbacks, who typically perform numerous high-intensity runs, will likely benefit from speed endurance maintenance training, because they need to tolerate a greater metabolic demand with less time to recover between the intense actions than other playing positions. Whereas attackers and centre-backs usually have longer recovery periods but more intense actions, for these players, speed endurance production training may be particularly relevant, as it comprises all-out efforts with long recovery and effectively enhances the ability to perform repeated high-speed running and sprinting. Because speed endurance maintenance and speed endurance production in particular induces high internal and external loads, often comprising repeated high-speed runs, sprints and cuts, it's recommended to prescribe set drills at least 72 hours before a match, i.e. early in the weekly microcycle and at the end of training sessions, so it does not impact the quality of any other training due to its fatiguing effects such as depressed neuromuscular function and micro-damage to muscles. Regarding the in-season microcycle, here's an example of how a typical week with intensified training can be structured for both professional and semi-professional teams during periods of matches played once per week. Combining aerobic HIIT and speed endurance training can be used to intensify the training and enhance performance in non-match loaded players. With this approach, the capacity of the aerobic energy system can be retained or increased, along with gaining the beneficial adaptations of speed endurance training. Match program constraints often only allow for intensified training for periods of 1 to 2 weeks, but as mentioned previously, this is sufficient to elicit positive performance benefits. However, to prevent the risk of injuries during intensified training, it's recommended to reduce training volume by 15 to 30% by decreasing the time spent on low to moderate intensity exercise. And that concludes the summary of the recommendations for implementing periods of intensified training with top-level football players. The link to the full article is in the description. I recommend you check it out for lots more nuggets of information. Thanks for listening, folks. See you next time.